Welcome to KU Padasala. My name is Chad Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America, and I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to discuss with you the fascinating topic of German for reading knowledge. In this 9th unit, we will move on to the very important topics of German word order, as well as the formation of the future tense within German. But before we move on to those topics, we need to consider now something which is very important to do in any language, but which is a little bit different in each one because of its highly idiomatic nature, which is how to assert the existence of something. Now, this is something which we may take for granted in English as obviously being done through the there is or there are such and such constructions. For example, if we want to assert the existence of a Chinese restaurant in a particular village, I could say, yes, there is a Chinese restaurant in my little village in America, only 3,000 people, but there is one Chinese restaurant in that village. However, if you go to a larger city like New York, you'll find that there's far more than just one Chinese restaurant in that major city. You'd have to say instead that there are many Chinese restaurants in New York City. So we have a slight difference there between the way that we assert the existence of the one Chinese restaurant in my village or the many Chinese restaurants in New York. But we take this for granted because we have a tacit understanding that the singular form is there is, but the plural form is there are. Well, that's the case in English perhaps, but only because we rely on a very strange convention here, which is in itself something like a pseudo construction that treats there as the perverse subject of the verb is or are, whereas in reality the subject of is or are just the restaurant or restaurants themselves. And they seem to be the object of that sentence simply because we have used a transformation to change the word order to put the subject into the object position, a very strange kind of passivization, by the way, while making the adverb of time or place there. By the way, there only tells you where something is located. We've made that into something like the subject simply because our brain is hardwired to search for the really important information in the space of predication within the sentence. That's why we do this. And this is something that you see repeated in many different languages, but by different means. So once again, in English, we accomplish this through the very strange passivization that makes there into something which looks like the subject, and the actual subject whose existence is being asserted into something like the object. So too in French, you actually do use a dummy subject, which is just it. If you speak French, you know that you assert the existence of something by saying il y a. Well, if you break those down into the basic components it is composed of, you'll see that il just means it. E is just the adverb basically saying there is how we might translate in this context, and a is just the conjugated form of to have. So il y a is literally just it there has, and then we assert the existence of the Chinese restaurant or the Chinese restaurants. But because we already have a dummy subject there, which is it, we don't need to change the form whether there is 1 or 1,000 Chinese restaurants, because they are not the grammatical subject of the conjugated verb. Similarly, in German, we don't use a construction that rearranges the word order such that the Chinese restaurant is still the subject of the verb to be, as it would be the case in English, while some adverb has been moved to the front. Rather, German is much closer to the French way of doing things. We have a dummy subject here, which is also it. In German, it is es. And rather than say it there has, which is the French way, we instead have the convention of it gives. Now, this might sound funny when you translate it literally into English. Well, it gives, that sounds kind of like a response to the question of what gives, which is something of an insult, something you say right before a fight if you've watched Hollywood movies. But in German, this kind of plays into the idea that you find within Latin, for example, that things which are given to the five senses are givens in the literal sense of being data. We have something a little bit like that here with this reference to es gibt. You assert the existence of something because it is one of those givens in the sense of data which is offered up to the senses. So if I say in German that something exists, I say es gibt, for example, es gibt eine gute Universität in der Stadt. So what exists here is a good university. We learn that the location of it is that it's in the city. Okay. But the university, once again, is not the subject. the sentence here. It's just the dummy subject, it, and the verb is not existence or sein or anything like that. It's rather just the conjugated form of geben, gibt. So this allows us to assert, in a certain sense, more simply the existence of a variety of different things without having to take consideration of whether they're singular or plural. Whether it's one university or many, we have es gibt. If we were to change the number of the university to several, it would still be es gibt einige Universitäten in der Stadt, rather than es gibt eine gute Universität in der Stadt. Now, the way that we would ask whether something exists, I'm searching, for example, I'm searching for the location. Where can be found the good university? Okay, I will put the interrogative at the beginning, which is wo, and then I will put that conjugated verb gibt still in the second position, and the real subject, it, will follow afterwards, with the thing whose existence is really being asserted following get after that. Now that might sound like a mouthful, but it's really quite simple if you see an example, like wo gibt es eine gute Universität? Wo, the interrogative word, gibt, the conjugated verb for gives, es, the dummy it subject, eine gute Universität, the thing we actually care about. Now, word order in German is a good deal more complicated even than we have been able to deal with thus far, so we'll take a moment now, near the end of this lecture course, to talk about it much more explicitly. Now, we've already considered the rule that the conjugated verb will appear in the second position and the second verb appears at the end, whether that be an infinitive or a past participle. And this is something which works as a general rule of thumb, but a lot of stuff can come in between there, which we basically just have to commit to memory by committing to paper the following formula. Now, this will look pretty intimidating the first time you see it, but I assure you, if you copy this down and work with it, it'll become second nature over time. So for the moment, we're just going to treat this as a formula like we would in, say, a mathematics class or a chemistry class. We have the sentence formula in German that, unless some other modification has been made, which we will discuss in the next slide, the basic word order is usually X, which is kind of a variable referring to things which might be in the first position. We've seen that the first position might be occupied by the subject of the noun, or excuse me, the subject of the conjugated verb, which is typically a noun or pronoun. But it might also be occupied by an interrogative word like when, where, how, etc. So that's why we mark the first slot within this formula as X, as a general variable for whatever has been placed there. The second item is V1, which is the conjugated verb. This is if you have an auxiliary paired with, say, an infinitive or a past participle. This is a verb like, haben, sein, functioning as, auxiliaries, though you also have the modal auxiliaries if you talk about what might or can or should happen, as we will get to later on. That is occupying position V1, which is the second position. After that, we have the variable little s, which refers to the subject, but only if the subject is a pronoun. We have certain rules of precedence in which, if you have the choice among many of these options and a pronoun subject happens to come first, then it'll be moved to the front. But if the subject is not a pronoun, some other things might come before it. For example, if the direct object is a pronoun, like in English, me or him or it pronouns rather than proper nouns, then that will come into the fourth position. An indirect object will follow after in the fifth position. Then we have big S, which indicates that this is the subject, but as a normal noun, not a pronoun like I or you, but rather a noun like the cow, the horse, the pig, as we're falling back on farm animals, for examples, as has been the case for this whole lecture series. But suffice it to say, big S will occupy that position, and then adverbs indicating things like time or place will fall in this basically middle position of the formula, followed by big indirect object, which is an indirect object which is not a pronoun, but rather a normal noun, like a cow, a pig, a horse. And then the direct object, which is, once again, a normal rather than pronoun. And then at the very end, we have that second verb, which is an infinitive or past participle. Now, that probably sounds like a mouthful, an enormous amount to process the first time you hear it. But once again, just write this down, deal with it as a formula you would in, say, mathematics or chemistry class, and it'll all make sense over time. But, of course, it wouldn't be a natural language if there were not exceptions to this rule. And one of those exceptions is dependent word order. Now, when we talk about dependent word order, that is an implicit reference to the distinction between an independent clause and a dependent clause. Put simply, an independent clause is a clause which can be a sentence on its own, while a dependent clause is something which cannot be a sentence on its own. For example, in modern English, if you have something like the cat is on the mat, that's an independent clause because that can be a sentence, albeit a very simple sentence. It can be a sentence on its own. But if you have a clause like because the cat is on the mat, that's not a complete sentence. Okay, I'm presuming that there's another clause there which is going to be paired with it, and together those will form a complete sentence. I could say, I didn't come in the room because the cat is on the mat, and the cat scared me. That's why I didn't come. I didn't come in the room because the cat is on the mat. Okay, kind of a silly example, but it's illustrating a grammatical point that the word because is something like a joiner of these two, but it's a different kind of joiner than just and. If I use the word and, I'm still dealing with two independent units of meaning. I didn't come in the room, and the cat is on the mat. Either one of those can be its own sentence. But if I use because, I now make that clause dependent in the sense that it requires something else to become a complete sentence. Well, you see this in German even more explicitly. The difference between coordinating conjunctions like and subordinating conjunctions like because, etc., in which it's not just that you have to add another clause to get a sentence. Even the rules of word order will be changed in German if you have a dependent clause. Now, the main rule that we care about right now is the suspension of the syntactic law that the conjugated verb occupy that second position. Very basic rule we learned very early on in this lecture series. That will change if you have a dependent clause with a word like, say, because, etc. Then the conjugated verb is actually moved to the end. You consider a fairly simple example with wir lernen in diesem Buch, dass Präsident Roosevelt im Jahre 1941 die vier Freiheiten verkündete. We learn in this book that President Roosevelt proclaimed the four freedoms in 1941. So we have two different ideas here. We learned in this book. We have a subject, a verb. We learned. Okay, so we have a clause there. President Roosevelt proclaimed the four freedoms in 1941. President Roosevelt is the subject. Proclaimed is the conjugated verb. So we have two different clauses here, okay, and they're joined in this case by the word that. So we learned that such and such was the case. The addition of that in the second clause makes it a dependent clause. That's why you see the verb in German verkündete at the end rather than in the second position. This is maybe more clear if you are working with two verbs in which one of them is an auxiliary putting into the past tense, like haben. In seinem Buch erklärt uns der Autor, warum Roosevelt sie uns in einer Radiorede vorgestellt hat. So here we have vorgestellt as a past participle and hat as the conjugated verb as an auxiliary putting in the past tense. Hat is actually coming at the end, even after the participle. And if we were dealing later on with infinitives, it would come even after that because this is dependent word order. So the first time you deal with this, it will seem very frustrating. Why do we have to, when you're speaking language especially, why do you have to make modifications if we have dependent clauses? Over time, it'll come to seem very, very natural, and it will come to be second nature for you. We'll now move on, though, to other cases that use two different verbs beyond just the transformation into the past tense that we saw with haben and sein earlier on. And that means really that we're going to finally encounter another tense. Remember that tense only really refers to time. It's present, past, or future. So we've covered the past and the present. That leaves the future, which is kind of mysterious because much like in English, the future in German is not indicated through an internal change of the word itself, as would be the case in, say, French or Italian. You have the saying I will say in French as je dirai. Dire is not two different words, will say, as would be the case in English. Rather, it's just a change to the one word of saying, which makes it into the future by adding the ending je dirais. That's French, because it's a Romance language. In German, it's actually very similar to English. You use something like the word will and then the infinitive, but the status of that word itself is so complicated that we have to pause for a moment and consider it more explicitly. That word which helps you to form the future tense is werden. Now, werden is one of the most important words in German because not only is it an auxiliary which allows you to form the future tense, it also does a lot more beyond just that. And one of the things it does is it has its own meaning in much the same way that haben does. Haben has its own meaning as describing the act of possessing something, in addition to being an auxiliary that puts something in a different tense. So too, werden does have its own meaning, which is simply to become. And therefore we can use it on its own in phrases like wir werden nicht älter, wir werden nur besser. We don't become older, we just become better. So in this case, wir werden is simply talking about the becoming as a standalone verb without any help from any other. Now, werden is, of course, irregular in the sense that the du and sie/s forms will differ in their vowel sound within the stem from the other forms, and will therefore have to learn these systematically. If we look at the conjugation in the present tense of werden, we have the following forms. Ich werde, I become. Du wirst, you become. Sie/s wird, he, she, or it becomes. Wir werden, we become. Ihr werdet, you all become. Sie werden and sie werden as they and formal you, respectively, once again distinguished only by how large the S is. The simple past tense is ich wurde, du wurdest, sie/s wurde, wir wurden, ihr wurdet, and sie/sie wurden. Now, when put into the perfect tenses, we will find the participle geworden used typically at the end of the sentence following after an auxiliary which is taken from sein. This would make sense because when you're talking about becoming, there's really not an object there. Now, it might seem that there's an object if you say something like he became old, but old actually is not the object of that verb to become. It's rather like the equal sign that you find with sein. You're making a statement of predication in which you're saying that he and old refer to the same person, two different symbols to refer to the same guy. Therefore, it's a lot more like to be, like a copula in formal linguistic terms. So, therefore, it would make sense that we would use sein rather than haben as the auxiliary to put this in the past tense. So, if we put this in the present perfect, we would say, ist alt geworden. He is grown old. Sie sind alt geworden. They have become old. Put into the properly past perfect, we get diese Maschine war zu alt geworden. This machine had become too old before some other thing took place. And diese Maschinen waren zu alt geworden. These machines had become too old. Now, I mentioned earlier on that werden is more than just the standalone verb talking about what becomes. For in addition to that, it allows you to form that mysterious future tense. Now, if you look closely at this is quite similar to the future tense in English. In English, we will say that something will happen by using two different verbs. Will as an auxiliary and happen, in this case, as that second verb. So too in German, we will use two verbs in the future tense, the first of which is a conjugated form of werden, and the second of which is an infinitive. In this example, dieses Auto wird sicher schneller fahren. We have that classic formula in which werd is the conjugated verb in the second position after dieses Auto, and fahren comes at the very end. This car, surely, or sicher, schneller, faster, fahren, go, and of course will has already put that into the future tense. But if you have dependent word order, you will see the will auxiliary werden occurring at the very end, even after the infinitive. Sie weiß nicht, ob sie heute Abend kommen werden. She does not know if they will come this evening, with the order of kommen and werden showing you once again infinitive and conjugated auxiliary in that order. However, werden does more than just put things into the future tense. There's also a kind of idiomatic usage here which you have to be aware of if you're going to be reading or speaking or listening to the language. And this is that werden is used in what are called probability statements. If you want to talk about something which you think is the case, but you're not exactly 100% sure. You're not trying to assert it, in other words, in a simply straightforward factual description manner. You can use some form of werden along with the infinitive to do that, even though that formula looks, the first time you see it, like the future tense. The caveat here is that you pair it with the word wohl, which basically means well. So a concrete example of this is wird wohl Deutsch studieren. It looks like he will study German, but it's really saying, because wohl is there, which means well, basically. I'm guessing that he's probably a German major. His subject that he's studying in college is probably German. I'm guessing that, though I'm not totally sure. Once again, wird wohl Deutsch studieren. If we were to talk about this in the past tense, you might think that we would change the conjugation of werden in the second position to the past tense, but we actually don't do that. We tack on haben to explicitly put this in the past tense, because remember, werd is used for another tense, which is the future. We use haben, but because of the rules of German syntax, we move that to the end, even beyond the participle, which is the action which was actually thought alleged to have been done. An example of this is, wird wohl Deutsch studiert haben. I'm guessing that he probably has studied German. So because we have three different verbs here, werd puts it into a probability statement, haben puts it into the past tense, and studiert is the participle of the action we're actually talking about. We have three of them. The rules of German word order are such that it will follow the form wird wohl Deutsch studiert haben.